The Oberst stood frozen at the edge of the Hürtgen forest, binoculars trembling in his gloved hands. What he saw made no sense. The American artillery barrage had been continuous for 16 hours. 16 hours, without pause, without weakening. His experienced mind tried to calculate the tonnage, the supply lines required, the sheer impossibility of what his eyes were reporting. In all his campaigns across Poland, France, and Russia, he had never witnessed such sustained firepower. Never. "Herr Oberst," his adjutant whispered, voice cracking. "They haven't stopped. Not once." The forest before them was simply gone. Acres of ancient trees reduced to splinters, German bunkers, concrete fortifications that had taken months to build, were smoking craters. And now, through the dust and cordite haze, came the Americans. Not in desperate charges, not in ragged waves. They advanced with mechanical precision, supported by more tanks than he could count, each one firing, moving, firing again in coordinated movements his own panzer units could only dream of achieving. His radio crackled. Reports flooded in from every sector. Positions overrun, supply dumps captured, retreat routes severed. One junior officer was screaming, actually screaming, about American ammunition expenditure. "They're firing more rounds in an hour than we receive in a month. How is this possible? How?" The Oberst lowered his binoculars. His hands weren't trembling from cold anymore. For 3 years, Wehrmacht propaganda had assured him the Americans were soft, undisciplined, industrially overrated. He'd believed it. They all had. The evidence was now obliterating his positions with methodical, almost contemptuous efficiency. This wasn't warfare as he understood it. This was industrial annihilation. And somewhere in that advancing line of Sherman tanks and muddy GIs was an enemy who had barely begun to show what America could do when it decided to win a war. The Second World War wasn't just the largest conflict in human history. It was the moment America proved that industrial might, when fully mobilized, could reshape the world. While German forces had spent years perfecting blitzkrieg tactics and occupying Europe, they'd made one catastrophic miscalculation. They'd underestimated what would happen when the United States decided to fight at full strength. This is the story of one American soldier who became part of that unstoppable machine. A tanker from the American heartland who would help demonstrate to Germany's finest divisions that all their early victories meant nothing once America's factories, farms, and fighting spirit focused on a single objective: total victory. But before we roll into battle, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me what city and state you're watching from. Let's see how far across America this story reaches. And if you appreciate these deep dives into the moments that defined the greatest generation, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered, and I need your help making sure they are. Now, let's meet the American who would show the Wehrmacht what real armored warfare looked like. Sergeant Bill Hendricks had grown up believing tanks were something other countries worried about. In his hometown of Peoria, Illinois, they made tractors, Caterpillar tractors that could plow fields from sunrise to sunset without complaint. When he'd enlisted in 1942, fresh out of high school, he'd assumed the Army would put him in the infantry. Instead, they'd taken one look at his farm boy hands and his mechanical aptitude scores and assigned him to armor school at Fort Knox. Now, in November 1944, he commanded an M4A3E8 Sherman tank, the EZ-8. And he was about to teach the Wehrmacht's 116th Panzer Division a lesson in American engineering they'd never forget. The Germans still believed their Tiger and Panther tanks were superior. Technically, on paper, gun for gun, they were right. A German 82-meter could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges where the Sherman's 76-meter gun barely scratched paint. Wehrmacht tankers knew this. They'd built their entire tactical doctrine around it. They expected American tanks to appear in small numbers, engage cautiously, and retreat when faced with superior German steel. What they didn't expect was quantity. They didn't expect logistics. They didn't expect American industry to produce Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them, and then produce even more. They especially didn't expect American tankers, who'd been trained to fight as coordinated teams, supported by artillery that could respond to radio calls in under 3 minutes, backed by supply lines that delivered hot meals, fresh ammunition, and replacement parts to the front lines with assembly line efficiency. Hendricks sat in his commander's cupola, scanning the approaches to the village of Hurtgen. His tank, he'd named her Illinois Steel, was positioned hull down behind a low ridge, only the turret exposed. To his left and right, 4 more Shermans from his platoon waited in similar positions. Behind them, another dozen tanks from the company. Behind those, an entire battalion. And behind that battalion, more American armor than the Germans could possibly imagine. His radio crackled. "Cherokee 6, this is Overwatch. Enemy armor detected. Your front, 800 yards. Count 4. Correction, 5 Panzers. Identified as Panzer IVs and at least 1 Panther." Hendricks felt his gunner, Corporal Danny Rizzo from Brooklyn, tense below him. They'd faced Panthers before. Everyone had heard the stories. American tanks burning, crews roasted alive because they'd tried to fight German heavies head-on. But Hendricks hadn't survived 7 months of combat by being stupid. "All Cherokee units, hold position," he radioed calmly. "Let them come to us." Through his periscope, he watched the German tanks emerge from the tree line. They moved with confidence, even arrogance. The Panther led, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly, searching for targets. The German commander probably expected scattered American resistance, maybe 1 or 2 Shermans hastily retreating, calling for air support that wouldn't arrive in time. What he got instead was a perfectly orchestrated ambush. "Overwatch, Cherokee 6. Request fire mission. Coordinates as marked. Cherokee 6, Overwatch. Shot out." 30 seconds later, American 155mm artillery rounds began landing among the German formation. Not a rolling barrage. Precision strikes called in by forward observers with radios and maps, adjusted in real time. The Wehrmacht was still using runners and field telephones for much of their coordination. America was fighting with instantaneous communication. The German tanks scattered, their neat formation breaking apart. The Panther accelerated, trying to close the distance, its commander recognizing the ambush too late. Its gun swiveled toward Hendricks' position. "Rizzo, target the Panther. Wait for my command." "Got him, Sarge." Hendricks waited. Patience. The Panther fired first, its shell screaming over Illinois Steel's turret, missing by 3 feet. The German gunner was good, but he was also rattled by the artillery, firing from a moving platform, and he'd underestimated how well American tankers had learned to use terrain. Fire. Rizzo's first shot struck the Panther's lower hull. Not a kill, but the heavy tank slewed to a stop, track damaged. Before the German crew could react, 2 more Shermans from Hendricks' platoon fired simultaneously. The principle was simple. German tanks might be individually superior, but they couldn't fight 5 Shermans at once. Concentrated American fire overwhelmed German armor through sheer volume and coordination. The Panther's turret hatches flew open. Crew bailed out, stumbling through the smoke. They'd been told Americans couldn't hurt Panthers. They'd been lied to. The remaining Panzer IVs tried to retreat, but now the full weight of American firepower revealed itself. Tank destroyers, M10 Wolverines with high-velocity guns, emerged from concealed positions. More artillery walked across the killing zone. And from the sky came the sound German tankers had learned to dread. The roar of American P-47 Thunderbolts, each one carrying bombs and rockets, each pilot in constant radio contact with ground controllers who could vector them onto targets within minutes. 1 Panzer IV took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. It simply disintegrated. Another tried to hide in a barn. American doctrine was simple about that. Burn the barn. A Sherman fired white phosphorus rounds, and within seconds, the structure was an inferno. The German crew surrendered rather than roast. In less than 8 minutes, the engagement was over. 5 German tanks destroyed or disabled, 0 American losses. But what shook the surviving Germans, the ones now being marched past Hendricks' position with their hands up, wasn't just the defeat. It was what they saw behind the American lines. Tank after tank after tank stretching back toward the horizon. Trucks bringing ammunition. Fuel trucks. Recovery vehicles already moving forward to repair damaged Shermans. Hot food being distributed to crews. Replacement tanks arriving on transporters. One captured German lieutenant, an aristocratic-looking officer with a Knight's Cross, stared at the scene with something like horror in his eyes. His English was good enough for him to ask Hendricks a question. "How many tanks do you have?" Hendricks smiled, thinking of those Caterpillar factories back in Peoria, now churning out Shermans instead of tractors. "Enough," he said simply. "More than enough." The German officer's face went pale. He understood. This wasn't a battle Germany could win through superior technology or tactical brilliance. This was mathematics, industry, logistics. All the unglamorous aspects of warfare that German propaganda had dismissed as unimportant compared to fighting spirit and racial superiority. As the prisoners were led away, Hendricks' radio crackled again. "Cherokee 6, Overwatch. Enemy reinforcements detected, moving your direction. Estimated 2 companies of infantry with armor support. Fire support standing by. Air support inbound. How copy?" Hendricks looked at his crew. Rizzo was already loading another armor-piercing round. Their loader, Private Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, had the ready rack fully stocked. Their driver, a former moonshiner from Kentucky named Tucker, had the engine purring smoothly. They'd been in combat for 7 months, and Illinois steel had never failed them, because when something broke, American supply sergeants fixed it or replaced it within hours. The Germans were learning what happened when you fought an enemy that could replace losses faster than you could inflict them, that could coordinate air and ground forces seamlessly, that treated logistics as seriously as tactics. They were learning that all their early victories had been won against opponents who couldn't match American industrial capacity. And they were learning it one destroyed panzer at a time. The German reinforcements arrived 90 minutes later, and they arrived angry. The 116th Panzer Division wasn't some second-rate occupation force. These were veterans who'd fought across France, survived the Eastern Front, and considered themselves among the Wehrmacht's elite. They'd lost contact with their forward elements, heard the explosions, seen the smoke. Now they were coming in force to restore their lines and teach these Americans a lesson about fighting real soldiers. Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner commanded the lead company. He'd earned his Iron Cross First Class at Kursk, survived encirclement at Falaise, and he knew armor tactics better than most officers twice his age. As his column moved through the forest trails toward Hürtgen, he felt confident. His intelligence reports indicated scattered American units, poorly coordinated, probably low on ammunition after their earlier engagement. Standard doctrine applied. Hit them hard, hit them fast, exploit their weak logistics before they could consolidate. What Steiner didn't know, what German intelligence consistently failed to grasp, was that American logistics didn't have weak points anymore. Not in November 1944. Not after 2 years of hard-learned lessons and industrial mobilization that had transformed the United States into what one German general would later call an arsenal with an army attached. Hendricks had used those 90 minutes well. His platoon had repositioned, establishing new firing positions with interlocking fields of fire. Combat engineers had laid anti-tank mines along the obvious approach routes. Artillery forward observers had pre-registered coordinates on every piece of terrain the Germans might use for cover. Tank destroyers had moved into ambush positions. And overhead, a flight of P-47s circled lazily, their pilots chatting with ground controllers, waiting for targets. The German column walked straight into it. Steiner's lead Panzer IV hit a mine first, the explosion shearing off its left track and slewing the 30-ton vehicle sideways, blocking the narrow forest road. Before his second tank could maneuver around it, American artillery began falling. Not random fire, not harassment, precisely coordinated salvos that had been calculated, adjusted, and approved while the Germans were still forming up their attack. "Contact front," Steiner's radio operator screamed, unnecessary because everyone could hear the shells landing, could see the trees exploding into splinters, could feel the ground shaking. Steiner ordered his tanks to disperse, to get off the road, to find fighting positions. Standard tactics. Exactly what he'd been trained to do. That's when the Shermans opened fire. They didn't charge. They didn't expose themselves. They fired from hull-down positions, worked in pairs, and when a German tank tried to return fire, 2 or 3 Shermans would engage it simultaneously. And if the German crew was good enough, lucky enough to score a hit and damage a Sherman, they'd watch in disbelief as American recovery vehicles, already positioned nearby, would race forward under covering fire, hook the damaged tank, and drag it to safety within minutes. Steiner had never seen anything like it. On the Eastern Front, a disabled tank was usually abandoned, stripped for parts if you were lucky, left burning if you weren't. American tanks got medical attention faster than German infantry. His radio filled with desperate calls. "Panzer IV-2, track damaged, need support." The transmission cut off as artillery found the disabled tank. "Panzer III-1, engaging multiple targets, request..." Another voice, younger, panicked. "They're everywhere. How many tanks do they have?" "Too many." That was the answer Steiner was beginning to understand. The Americans had too many tanks, too much ammunition, too much of everything. His company had brought 18 Panzers into this fight. He could see at least 20 American tanks from his position, and his instincts, honed by years of combat, told him there were dozens more just out of sight, waiting in reserve. Then the thunderbolts came. The P-47s dove from 3,000 feet, their massive radial engines screaming, 8 .50 caliber machine guns in each wing firing, rockets streaking toward German positions. Steiner threw himself flat as a rocket slammed into a half-track 50 meters away, turning it into shrapnel and flame. Another P-47 dropped a bomb that landed so close the concussion lifted him off the ground. But what terrified him more than the attack itself was the coordination. The American ground controllers were talking to the pilots in real time, directing them to specific targets, adjusting their runs, warning them away from friendly positions. The Luftwaffe had once operated like this, back in 1940, back when Germany had fuel and trained pilots and functioning radios. Now the Americans did it routinely, casually, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Fall back," Steiner ordered. "All units, withdraw to secondary positions." The retreat was chaos. German tanks reversed down narrow trails, some getting stuck, others taking fire from American tank destroyers that seemed to appear from nowhere. Infantry that had dismounted to support the armor found themselves pinned by American machine gun fire. 30 caliber Brownings that fired so fast, so continuously, that German soldiers whispered they must be feeding ammunition belts a kilometer long. Hendricks watched the Germans retreat through his periscope. His gunner had scored 2 confirmed kills, both Panzer IVs caught in the open. Illinois steel had taken 1 hit that had bounced off the frontal armor, leaving nothing but a scar in the steel and a ringing in everyone's ears. Around him, the rest of his platoon was intact, already receiving fresh ammunition from supply trucks that had rumbled forward the moment the shooting started. Cherokee 6, Overwatch. Enemy withdrawal confirmed. Pursuit orders? Hendricks considered. His instinct was to press the attack, to chase the Germans and finish them. But he'd also learned that American doctrine valued preservation of force. Why risk his crews when artillery and air power could do the killing from a distance? Negative, Overwatch. Will hold position. Request fire mission on their withdrawal routes. Cherokee 6. Fire mission approved. Coordinates being plotted now. Within 3 minutes, American 155mm shells were landing among the retreating German column. Forward observers called adjustments. The artillery responded instantly, walking the barrage along the forest roads, turning the Germans' retreat into a running nightmare of explosions and flying steel. Steiner made it back to his rally point with 11 of his 18 tanks. 7 lost in less than an hour of combat. Worse than the losses was what he'd seen. The Americans fighting with a level of support and coordination that seemed impossible. Every American tank commander had a radio. Every infantry squad could call for artillery. Every unit had air support on call. The Wehrmacht had some of these capabilities, in theory, on paper, when equipment worked and supplies arrived. The Americans had all of it, all the time, functioning like a machine. His radio operator, a veteran sergeant named Hoffman, sat slumped against a tree, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "Herr Oberleutnant," he said quietly, "we can't fight this. We can't fight all of that." He gestured vaguely toward the American lines. Steiner wanted to reprimand him for defeatism. Instead, he found himself nodding, because Hoffman was right. You couldn't fight an industrial machine with courage and tactical skill alone. You couldn't outmaneuver an enemy that had enough resources to make mistakes, absorb losses, and keep attacking. You couldn't win against opponents who treated warfare like an engineering problem and solved it with overwhelming material superiority. That night, as Steiner wrote his after-action report by candlelight, the Germans were rationing fuel for generators now. He tried to find words to explain what he'd encountered. Not just American tanks, not just American firepower, something bigger, something that made every previous Wehrmacht victory feel hollow and temporary. He settled on a phrase that would appear in many German reports over the coming months. The enemy possesses unlimited resources and employs them with mechanical efficiency. It was the closest he could come to admitting that Germany was fighting an opponent it could never defeat. An opponent that had turned warfare into industrial production and treated tank battles like assembly lines. The Americans weren't just winning through superior tactics or technology. They were winning because they'd made war itself into something Germany couldn't compete with. A test of organizational capacity, industrial output, and logistical sustainability. And in that test, there was only one possible outcome. By December 1944, the 116th Panzer Division had learned to recognize the signs of an impending American attack. First came the observation aircraft, small, slow L-4 grasshoppers that seemed to fly with impunity because the Luftwaffe had been reduced to scattered remnants. Then the artillery registration rounds, precise shots that walked across potential German positions, mapping everything for future bombardment. Finally, the buildup. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks, and mountains of supplies accumulating behind American lines in quantities that made veteran German soldiers physically ill to witness. Hendricks and Illinois Steel had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks now. They'd pushed through Hürtgen, fought in the approaches to the Roer River, and destroyed more German armor than he'd bothered counting. But what struck him most wasn't the fighting itself. It was the routine nature of American superiority. Every morning, hot breakfast arrived from field kitchens. Every afternoon, ammunition trucks replenished their combat loads. Every evening, maintenance crews swarmed over the tanks, replacing worn parts, fixing minor damage, ensuring everything worked. When his tank's radio failed, a replacement was installed within 4 hours. When Rizzo complained about the gun sight's accuracy, an armorer appeared the next day with a new one. The Germans, meanwhile, were falling apart. Major Friedrich Weber commanded what remained of the 116th Panzer's 2nd Battalion, 12 operational tanks from an authorized strength of 45. He sat in his command half-track, reading reports that painted a picture of slow-motion disintegration. Fuel deliveries were irregular. Ammunition was being rationed. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training because Germany's training schools were being bombed around the clock by American B-17s. Spare parts were scavenged from destroyed vehicles because the factories that produced them had been turned into rubble by American strategic bombing. But worst of all was the realization that nothing his division did seemed to matter. They could fight brilliantly, execute perfect tactical maneuvers, bloody the Americans in local engagements. And the next day, the Americans would attack again with fresh troops, new equipment, and the same overwhelming material advantage. Weber had fought in Russia. He knew what attrition warfare looked like, but this was different. The Soviets won through mass and willingness to accept casualties. The Americans won through industrial capacity and the complete absence of supply constraints. They didn't sacrifice men needlessly. American doctrine emphasized firepower over manpower, which meant calling in artillery instead of sending infantry into machine gun fire. But they could afford to lose equipment because more equipment arrived constantly. His chief of staff, a gaunt captain named Richter, entered the half-track with the morning intelligence summary. "The Americans are massing again," he reported flatly. "Estimated 2 battalions of armor, supported by mechanized infantry, and at least 4 battalions of artillery." Weber didn't ask how Richter knew. You could hear American preparations, the sound of hundreds of engines, the grinding of tank treads, the shouted orders of sergeants who didn't bother with noise discipline because they didn't need to. Stealth was for forces that lacked strength. The Americans simply assembled overwhelming power and then used it. "Our orders?" Weber asked, already knowing the answer. "Hold the line. Counterattack if opportunity presents itself. Withdraw only on direct orders from division." Standard orders. Meaningless orders. The kind of orders that assumed both sides operated under similar constraints, that tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantage. Weber had stopped believing that weeks ago. The American attack began at 0600 hours with an artillery barrage that lasted 45 minutes. Weber huddled in a bunker as the earth shook, as shells landed with metronomic precision, as the carefully prepared German positions were systematically obliterated. He'd experienced Soviet artillery barrages that were heavier but less accurate. American artillery wasn't about raw tonnage. It was about precision, coordination, and the certainty that every forward observer had unlimited ammunition to call upon. When the barrage lifted, the Shermans came. Hendricks led his platoon forward through the smoke and dust, moving in a coordinated wedge formation. His company commander had briefed them on the plan: punch through the German line, exploit to the river crossing, establish a bridgehead. Simple objectives executed with overwhelming force. To his left, another company of Shermans advanced in parallel. To his right, tank destroyers provided overwatch. Behind them, mechanized infantry in half-tracks waited to exploit any breakthrough. The Germans tried to resist. A concealed Panther opened fire from a tree line, its first shot destroying the lead Sherman from Hendricks' company. But before the German tank could reload, 6 American tanks engaged it simultaneously, their 76 scimitar guns hammering the Panther's position until it brewed up in flames. The Germans tried an infantry counterattack with Panzerfausts, disposable anti-tank weapons that could kill a Sherman at close range. American artillery observers spotted the forming infantry and called down a fire mission that turned the counterattack into a massacre. Weber watched his battalion dissolve, not through cowardice. His men fought with desperate courage, but through simple mathematics. Every German tank that scored a kill was immediately targeted by multiple American vehicles. Every German strongpoint that held was bypassed and reduced by artillery. Every tactical success was local, temporary, and ultimately meaningless because the Americans just kept coming. His radio operator turned to him, face pale. "Herr Major, all companies reporting heavy casualties. Panzer III requests permission to withdraw. Panzer V is surrounded and requesting. The transmission dissolved into static and screaming. Weber made the decision that German commanders across the Western Front were making with increasing frequency. All units, fighting withdrawal to secondary positions. Move now. But retreating from Americans in 1944 wasn't like retreating from the French in 1940, or even the British in North Africa. The Americans pursued with armored cavalry, called in airstrikes on withdrawal routes, and had the fuel and ammunition to maintain pressure indefinitely. What should have been an organized pullback became a scrambling retreat as P-47s strafed the roads and American tanks appeared on flanks that should have been secure. Hendrick's platoon reached the Roa River by noon. Behind them, combat engineers were already bringing up bridging equipment, prefabricated sections that could be assembled under fire, another example of American industrial planning. A German artillery battery tried to shell the crossing site, but was silenced within minutes by counter-battery fire. American artillery radars could detect the location of enemy guns from their muzzle flashes and call down retaliatory strikes before the German crews could displace. By nightfall, 2 battalions of American armor were across the river, digging in, already being resupplied. Weber's battalion, what remained of it, had retreated 15 kilometers and lost another 5 tanks. They'd inflicted casualties, destroyed perhaps a dozen American vehicles, killed or wounded maybe 200 American soldiers. And it didn't matter, not even a little bit. That night, an exhausted Richter showed Weber the latest intelligence summary. American reinforcements were already moving forward. Fresh divisions, new equipment, full supply columns. The Americans had lost tanks today, probably 30 or more across the entire sector. By tomorrow, replacement Shermans would be arriving from depots that held thousands of vehicles. Germany's entire monthly tank production was roughly equivalent to what the Americans could lose in a week of heavy fighting and immediately replace. "We cannot win this," Richter said quietly. It wasn't defeatism anymore. It was mathematics. Weber didn't respond immediately. He thought about the early war years, the victories in France, the myth of German invincibility. They'd been fighting opponents who couldn't match German tactical skill or battlefield coordination. Now they faced an opponent who could match them tactically and overwhelm them materially. Courage didn't matter. Tactical brilliance didn't matter. Superior individual weapons didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere in America, factories were running 3 shifts a day, producing tanks and trucks and shells. That American farms were feeding not just their own army, but their allies. That American training camps were turning out crews faster than Germany could kill them. That American logistics officers treated supply lines as seriously as German officers treated tactics. The Wehrmacht had spent 5 years preparing for a short, decisive war. The Americans had spent 3 years preparing for industrial total war, and in that kind of war, there was only one possible outcome. Hendrick sat on Illinois Steel's fender, eating hot stew from a mess kit while mechanics changed the tank's oil. Tomorrow they'd attack again, push deeper into Germany, face more desperate resistance. And the day after that, they'd do it again. Not because individual American soldiers were supermen, but because the system supporting them was unstoppable. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question was how long it would take Germany to accept the inevitable. The winter of 1945 brought Germany's final, desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, hoarded fuel and ammunition, and assembled 28 divisions for one massive surprise attack. The plan was audacious: smash through the weakly held Ardennes sector, drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial power could completely overwhelm the Reich. For 48 hours, it almost worked. German forces achieved complete surprise, breaking through American lines held by inexperienced divisions. Panzers rolled westward in scenes reminiscent of 1940. Wehrmacht commanders felt a surge of old confidence. Maybe they could still win this war through superior tactics and aggressive maneuver. Maybe the Americans would crack under pressure like the French had. Maybe quality could still triumph over quantity. Then, reality set in. Hendricks and Illinois Steel were in reserve when the German offensive began, refitting after the Roa River campaign. On December 17th, his entire battalion received emergency orders. Move to the Ardennes immediately. Maximum speed, combat load everything. Within 6 hours, they were rolling. Within 24 hours, they'd covered over 100 miles and were entering the battle zone. What shocked the Germans wasn't just the speed of American response, it was the scale. Entire divisions were rerouted mid-movement. The 101st Airborne was trucked to Bastogne and ordered to hold at all costs. Patton's Third Army executed a 90-degree turn and attacked northward into the German flank. An operational maneuver that Wehrmacht staff officers had calculated would take weeks to organize. Patton did it in 3 days. And behind this massive troop movement came the supplies. Trucks, tens of thousands of trucks, rolled day and night, delivering ammunition, fuel, food, winter clothing, medical supplies. The roads were a solid mass of American logistics, coordinated by officers with radios, maps, and the absolute certainty that whatever the fighting forces needed would arrive on time. Oberst Heinrich von Schlieben commanded a Kampfgruppe that had achieved one of the deepest penetrations of the American lines. His Tigers and Panthers had rolled through American positions, destroyed supply dumps, and briefly touched the Meuse River. For 3 glorious days, he'd felt like it was 1940 again. Mobile warfare, enemy forces in confusion, victory within reach. Then the American cordon tightened. Von Schlieben first noticed it on December 20th. His fuel trucks hadn't arrived. Radio contact with division was intermittent. American fighter bombers appeared overhead the moment clouds broke, strafing anything that moved. His spearhead, which should have been racing toward Antwerp, was instead grinding to a halt as fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Behind him, American forces were sealing the breakthrough, not in panic, not in disorganization, with methodical efficiency. Artillery battalions displaced to new firing positions and began hammering German supply routes. Tank destroyer battalions established killing zones on every road. And most devastating of all, the skies cleared. The Luftwaffe had promised air support. It never came, couldn't come, because Germany's remaining aircraft were outnumbered 50-1, and what fuel existed was needed for the ground offensive. The Americans, meanwhile, launched the largest air operation of the war. Thousands of bombers and fighters filled the sky, attacking German columns, destroying bridges, obliterating supply depots, turning the offensive's rear areas into a burning wasteland. Hendricks' battalion hit the German southern flank near Bastogne on December 22nd. The fighting was brutal, close-range tank battles in forests and villages, often at ranges where German gun superiority meant nothing because everyone could penetrate everyone else's armor. But numbers told. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every American casualty, replacements arrived within days. The Germans were burning through their irreplaceable reserves while fighting an enemy that treated losses as temporary inconveniences. Von Schlieben's Kampfgruppe was trapped near Celles, his Tigers reduced to pillboxes because they'd run out of fuel. American artillery had found his positions and was methodically destroying them. His radio operator intercepted American communications. Casual conversations between tank commanders, discussions about where to eat Christmas dinner, complaints about mud and cold that seemed absurdly mundane given the circumstances. What struck von Schlieben was the tone. These Americans weren't desperate or afraid. They were annoyed, tired, but fundamentally confident. They spoke like factory workers complaining about overtime, not soldiers facing battlefield crisis. On December 23rd, the weather cleared completely. Von Schlieben watched from his immobilized Tiger as the sky filled with American aircraft. Not a dozen or 100, thousands of them. C-47 transports dropping supplies to Bastogne, P-47s hitting German positions, medium bombers cratering roads, reconnaissance aircraft circling lazily, directing artillery onto any German movement. His gunner, a 20-year-old veteran named Klaus, stared upward with empty eyes. "So many," he whispered. "Where do they all come from?" Von Schlieben knew the answer. They came from American factories that worked around the clock. From pilot training schools that graduated new crews every week. From oil refineries that produced more fuel in a day than Germany produced in a month. From an industrial base that treated this offensive not as an existential crisis, but as a production problem to be solved with more material. The attack reached von Schlieben's position on December 26th. He counted 30 American tanks in the first wave alone, supported by infantry and half-tracks, preceded by an artillery barrage that lasted 90 minutes. His Tigers fought. They scored kills, brewed up 5 Shermans with precise long-range shots. It didn't matter. The Americans absorbed the losses, called in airstrikes, brought up tank destroyers, and systematically reduced each German position. When von Schlieben's ammunition ran out, he had a choice: die pointlessly or surrender. He chose surrender, emerging from his Tiger with hands raised, watching as American soldiers, many of them looking barely old enough to shave, secured his crew with casual efficiency. They weren't triumphant or cruel. They were professionals doing a job, and their confidence came from knowing the job was nearly finished. A young American lieutenant, maybe 22 years old, examined von Schlieben's Tiger with interest. "Nice tank," he said in passable German. "Shame you don't have gas for it." He gestured toward the American rear areas, where fuel trucks sat in long queues, where supply dumps stretched to the horizon. "We've got enough fuel to drive to Berlin twice over. You guys should have thought about that before starting this thing." Von Schlieben had no response. What could he say? That German planning had assumed American logistics would collapse under pressure? That Hitler had bet everything on achieving quick victory before American material superiority could deploy? That the entire offensive had been a desperate gamble born from refusing to accept mathematical reality? By January 1945, the bulge was closed. The Germans had lost over 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, countless trucks and supplies, losses they absolutely could not replace. The Americans had suffered similar casualties, but had already replaced their losses and were preparing new offensives. Units that had been shattered in December were rebuilt and refitted in weeks. Divisions that had bled heavily were reinforced with fresh troops, new equipment, full ammunition loads. Hendricks and Illinois Steel ended the battle exactly where American doctrine said they should be: maintained, supplied, ready for the next mission. His crew was exhausted but intact. His tank had taken hits but was already repaired. His battalion had lost tanks but had received replacements. The entire American army was like a machine that could absorb damage, repair itself, and keep grinding forward. In POW camps across Europe, captured German soldiers told the same stories. Stories of American artillery that never ran out of shells, of American tanks that kept coming no matter how many you destroyed, of American supply trucks that appeared anywhere, anytime, with whatever was needed, of an enemy that fought not with desperate courage, but with industrial certainty. The Wehrmacht had entered the war believing in tactical brilliance, individual heroism, and racial superiority. They were ending it facing an opponent that believed in logistics, industrial production, and systematic organization. And in that contest, there had only ever been one possible winner. Hendricks sat on Illinois Steel's turret that final night of December, writing a letter home to Peoria. He described the fighting, the cold, the friends lost. But what he couldn't quite capture in words was the larger truth he'd witnessed. American victory wasn't about superior soldiers or better tactics. It was about a nation that had mobilized its entire industrial capacity, organized it with ruthless efficiency, and applied it to warfare with the same systematic approach that built railroads and skyscrapers. The Germans had been warriors, the Americans had been engineers, and in modern war the engineers won every time.